Hello and welcome to today's session. Today we are looking at this essay by T.S. Eliot. It's titled Tradition and Individual Talent. It's a 1919 essay and it's considered as one of the finest works and the best known works of criticism by Eliot. Eliot, as we know, he was also a poet and he was perhaps the best known poet of the modernist period. So there is a kind of literary modernism that we can find in his poetical works as well as in his critical works. So what makes his critical works, his criticism, very different and distinctive is the fact that there's a combination of literary modernism as well as a political conservatism. So writing at a time which is right after the Victorian age and when the romantic principles are still reigning high in certain ways, we find him going against the grain of tradition, the way in which tradition is seen. The title itself is Tradition and the Individual Talent. So there's a way in which he tries to bring in two things which have been going in two different directions, which have been seen as two different things in the during the classical age as well as during the modern English literary critical stage, where it was seen as two different things, tradition as well as individual talent. So here we find Eliot trying to bring in a kind of a synergy by trying to locate tradition in a very different way, in a very modernist way. But at the same time, we also find a certain kind of conservatism, which also becomes a hallmark of modernist criticism for a number of decades since then. So here's how Eliot begins with this essay. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or to a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so-and-so is traditional or even too traditional. So there's a way in which Eliot draws our attention to the fact that tradition has not always been seen as a wonderful thing, especially within the native English literary critical tradition. This is what we had seen during the Romantic period, during the Romantic critical phase, where we saw a very stark departure, very significant departure from the neoclassical principles. So the Romantic poets and the Romantic literary tradition had moved away considerably from what was seen as poetical tradition until that point of time, what was seen as literary tradition until that point of time. So tradition was not really considered as a great word, as a great notion as far as literature was concerned in the early 20th century. So Eliot is very much aware of this tendency of having moved away from traditional notions, and he acknowledges this skepticism that he and others during that time obviously had towards a tradition. And now it's very interesting ways he will try to situate the idea of tradition as he engages with it in a very individualistic sense as well as within the frameworks of modernism, but of course it's also very, very conservative in multiple ways, as we would begin to see. Seldom perhaps does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, it is vaguely approbated, with the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. So we find many things, many other disciplines engaging in a dialogue with literary critical tradition over here, and Eliot is very much conscious of the fact that the word tradition needs to be made agreeable for English ears, because there is a discomfort when it comes to tradition. And during the Victorian period also, we saw that in spectacular ways, where theological traditions, literary traditions, scientific tradition, everything had been challenged, and a new set of belief system, a new set of value system, a new economic administrative system, a new political system, everything had come into place. Even the way in which people look at the world, evaluate the way in which they deal with each other, deal with emotions, deal with culture, everything had changed during the end of the 19th century. So in the early 20th century, while Eliot is writing, he is very much conscious of the need to repack tradition, to present tradition in such a way that it needs to be made agreeable to English ears. And a reassurance is needed, he says. Tradition, when it comes along with this reassuring science of archaeology, he believes, and he goes on to state in multiple ways within the literary framework, that it becomes more agreeable, it becomes more modern, it becomes more palatable to English ears. Certainly, the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. We know or think we know from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language, the critical method or habit of the French, we only conclude, we are such unconscious people, that the French are more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact as if the French were the less spontaneous. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing. Here we find a poet critic reiterating the significance of criticism, and as well as the need to believe that English criticism is sufficient enough to deal with the culture and the literature which is being produced during that age, and that we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book and feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. So we find him accentuating the ability of the human mind to engage with the text individually without engaging with tradition entirely, but the capacity of the individual mind, the human mind, to engage with the literary work and also pass judgments on it based on emotion. So we find that it's extremely impressive that in the early modernist period, when there is a very evident move towards literature in a different way altogether, we find emotion being underscored in significant ways over here. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. He's talking about originality over here. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the man. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. If you look at the way in which literary ages have been divided, literary classifications have been made, it's always about continuity and more about departures. The moment a writer or a certain tradition departs from the previous writers, from the previous age, we take it to be the beginning of, it signals the beginning of a different tradition altogether, different kind of era of writing altogether. So there are these transitions and departures which are very significant in demarcating different literary ages and also in demarcating different literary traditions at various points of time. So here we find Eliot articulating this commonsensical kind of notion which had always existed about literature and about these different classifications which have been made. And we also find him trying to focus, trying to underscore the need for a certain timelessness, a certain universality which would defy these conventions and these kind of classifications, which is what we will find in another essay of Eliot, where he brings back to significance the metaphysical poets who were never considered significant during their own lifetime or even at a later time. Johnson had coined the term metaphysical poets, and they were never considered in great regard. But Eliot, we find that he has a fine way of combining traditional elements along with the individual talent, and that gives him specific tools to bring up and highlight and give significance, render importance to a group of poets like metaphysical poets or many other things as we would see in the course of this essay. Whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. So these two sentences are very loaded, I think. On the one hand, he is celebrating, he is acknowledging the significance of individual talent, but he's also saying that while we are being conscious of the departures made from one era to the other, from one literary age to the other, from one literary tradition to the other, we also need to pay attention to the continuity. The continuity becomes more important over here than the originality or the individuality of the writer himself. And he says the dead poets, the presence, the reminiscence of the dead poets may be found in these individual works, in these original works. That is how the immortality of tradition gets asserted. And he also says, he also goes on to argue that unless this continuity is seen, unless this reminiscences are noticed, the poet does not find any significance at all. Just with individual talent, just with the original creativity, the poet perhaps cannot survive within the framework of canon. That's a larger point that he is also trying to make. And this, when he talks about the impressionable period of adolescence and the period of full maturity, he has in mind the larger volume of work, the corpus of work, the body of work that we needs to engage with as far as a writer is concerned. It's not just about particular individual works produced during different stages of the writer's life, but the work which, the body of work which could be seen as a culmination of his creative maturity. And in such a way, he goes on to argue, yet if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should positively be discouraged. So tradition, what is not tradition? In this passage, he is trying to engage with the term tradition, and he, if you remember in the first paragraph itself, he says it's important to make this term agreeable to English ears, because there is a lot of skepticism about this term. It has been seen as something which is not commendable when it comes to originality, when it comes to moving towards, when it comes to transitioning and departing from the older ways of writing, older ways of presenting culture. But here he says it should not be mistaken for blind or timid adherence. It is not blind imitation at all, and that should be discouraged, very positively be discouraged. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. If you know your history of literature, you would remember that there were a lot of imitators, the imitators of different major writers, including Chaucer to begin with. And these imitators, who were then known as Chaucerians, they could not flourish for a long time, and their work did not live into the posterity. And Sidney, if you remember, he spoke about the poet apes. Imitation does not guarantee any kind of lasting significance as far as literature is concerned. Of course, there is a way in which the dead poets do leave their mark on these original individual writers, but that should not be confused with, that should not be mistaken for imitation, because imitation has never been a successful model as far as literary writing is concerned. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. So in this essay, we will see that throughout this piece, Eliot is trying to situate tradition within a very large context. He combats provincialism. He moves out of England and he talks about a very European tradition. He talks about including many things other than what is produced within England itself. Of course, there is a certain kind of Eurocentrism which gets critiqued at a later point of time, but nevertheless, it's important to mark this as a significant departure, as a significant milestone where an English critic is willing to move out of the provinciality, move out of these the delimiting way in which literature and criticism has been viewed, and then talk about a European tradition altogether. And here he continues, it cannot be inherited. So tradition is not something which could be blindly imitated. It has to be discouraged, and it cannot be inherited either. And if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. So tradition, the way it is seen in a traditional way, is something which is imitated, which you inherit without belaboring for it. But here Eliot reminds us, this tradition that we are talking about, the literary tradition that one is talking about, it cannot be inherited. On the other hand, if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. That is entirely a willful kind of action from a poet or a critic. If you want to inherit it, you need to put some work on it. Modernist literature also, if you think about it, it's also about work. It's also about engaging with the writer, engaging with the work of art with a certain kind of labor. And it's the meaning making process does not come to you automatically. You need to put in some work along with the text in order to make sense of it. We find that same attitude getting reflected here in Eliot's criticism as well. It involves in the first place the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And this is very, very important. Eliot does not consider any kind of short-lived writing as creative engagement at all, which is why he in the earlier passage also he talks about not the period of adolescence but the period of full maturity. He thinks it is one could be referred to as a poet only if he continues to display this sense of maturity towards his later ages as well. So here he's being more direct when he says it's about anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year, not just the impressionable adolescence period when you have certain kind of a fling with literary writing for a brief period and then move on to other things. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. So, tradition, first of all, there is a historical sense, but it is not entirely about the past. It is also about the present. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Here, Eliot is moving beyond particular kinds of writers, certainly beyond individual writers, and he is talking about a holistic kind of tradition which gets inherited, of course, with a lot of labor. And here, it's about the entire body of writing which exists, not just within England, but also from across Europe. And it's a timeless thing too. It starts from Homer onwards. It's not about one particular age. It's not about a certain set of writers. It's about a cumulative effect that the present writer has, the present writer receives from a range of writers since Homer from across Europe. This historical sense, now he's being very, very direct here, which is a sense of the timeless as well as the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. So this is tradition for him. It's a combination of the traditional as well as the modern, the present. It's about timelessness as well as of the temporal. So this combination is what makes Eliot's criticism and modernist criticism very different from the previous ages. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his own contemporaneity. Unless a writer is conscious about his past, unless a writer is knowledgeable about the tradition within which his work could be situated, his own genius could be situated, he says his own place would not be, his own sense of belonging would not be complete at all. So, the knowledge of the past, the knowledge of the tradition, the significance of this inheritance is what makes the poet, is what makes this poet situate himself or herself within his or her own time. Unless this kind of a situation does not happen, unless this sort of a framing does not happen, Eliot perhaps is arguing that the poet who is writing in the present does not know how to place himself or herself. He or she will be entirely out of place, not knowing where to map his own self or the kind of writings that they are producing. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. Yeah. So this is certainly about this fine combination, the fine synergy that Eliot hopes to achieve between the individual as well as the tradition. And the tradition is, of course, as he reminded us, not about one or two poets, or not about a set of writers, or not about a particular period. It's about this holistic cumulative effect which has been inherited, which has been handed down to these generations from the time of Homer, and this is from a range of places from across Europe. And this tradition cannot be inherited automatically. You need to put in a labor for that. That said, he continues to say, the significance of this poet, his significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. And in certain ways, it's possible to see that this sort of comparison, this sort of a comparative analysis, it was always there. There was always a certain way in which writers were compared with their predecessors. And in one of Dryden's essays, he makes a comparison between Chaucer and the early Roman classical writers. But here, how Eliot becomes different is, it's not about particular kind of writers, it's about this entire cumulative tradition, and he continues to emphasize that. That becomes all the more evident the way in which he is not taking individual names, he's not limiting his analysis or his engagement with particular periods or writers. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. And the necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. So, tradition, first of all, he says it's not blind imitation. Then he says it is not about an automatic kind of inheritance. You need to labor in order to get it. And thirdly, he says tradition is not something which is static, it continues to change. There is a timelessness about tradition, but it also continues to change. It's in a state of flux all the time, and that is a kind of tradition that Eliot thinks should be applauded. And this is how he makes tradition very much agreeable to English ears. So, according to this, according to Eliot's aesthetic principle, when a new work of art is being created, it's not just a new creation which happens, it also changes the way in which all the other previous works have been received. So, there is no fixed way in which a literary work and a work of art could be received. It's in a change of flux always, and this is very evident if you think about the Johnson's preface, which cemented the literary reputation of William Shakespeare. We find that the reception of that work, reception of Shakespeare's works, had undergone significant changes from one age to the other. And with every passing century, with newer works and newer traditions emerging, we find that the sense with which Shakespeare's works were received in the in its original ecosystem, that also continues to change. There is nothing static about the quality of literary reception. There's nothing static about the quality of literary genius which we could identify with any of these works. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered, and so the relations, the proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. So, when a new work is being created, when the individual artist's originality or creative genius is at work, we find that it alters everything which had gone by. The tradition itself gets altered. So, this is how tradition becomes a more agreeable kind of a word. It's not something which is fixed, it's not something which is static, it continues to change in accordance with the newer works, the really new works which are being produced. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. So, here we also find another transition which is at work over here. Poetry, literature, work of art, it's not just about leisure, it's not just about pleasure, it's about hard work, it's about difficulty, it's about responsibility. So, there is a way in which literature in this modernist period, in the early 20th century, it also begins to be situated within the larger framework which includes other disciplines as well. There is a kind of very, very intelligent engagement that the literary artist demands, and this is evident in the aesthetic appreciation, in the critical appreciation that Eliot is trying to formulate as well. There's another flip side to this which Eliot is aware of, and he is also alerting the fellow poets and critics to this. In a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them, not judged to be as good as or worse or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. This is very, very important. He gives a different dimension to literary judgment altogether. When a new work is judged based on the standards of the past, based on the works produced by the dead poets, the intention is not to entirely annihilate the new work of art because it does not conform or does not subscribe to the older notions. It's not about amputating this entire work altogether, but it is about evaluating it, and judgment takes a different notion altogether in the modernist period, as we could see over here. To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all. It would not be new, it would therefore not be a work of art. So, there's a thin line between this tradition and the present modern ways that Eliot is talking about. If when the writer is, of course, judged by the past, and there's a certain standard which is in place, and there's a continuity which needs to be kept as well. But at the same time, if the writer decides to only conform, there would not be a new work at all. So there is a thin line, there's a fine line between this maintenance of tradition as well as this engagement with original creative genius. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting in is a test of its value. A test, it is true, which only can be slowly and cautiously applied, for we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. So this is a very delicate kind of aesthetics that Eliot is putting forward. If the new work fits in with tradition, yeah, it does not easily mean that it is the best. And in the same way, when it fits in, it's also a test of its value. So there has to be sufficient degree of originality for the work to be different, but it should also fit in within the traditional frameworks. When he says fit in, it's not entirely about conforming, it's not entirely about surrendering to the orders of the past, but it's also about ensuring a continuity without compromising on the originality. We say it appears to conform and is perhaps individual, or it appears individual and many conform, but we are hardly likely to find that it is one and not the other. This perhaps is the true test of literature as far as Eliot is concerned. There should be sufficient degree of originality, but it should not be in discontinuity with the past. There should be a sufficient degree of continuity in order to see how the literary tradition has been inherited, but it should also be original enough in order to acknowledge that this is original, creative, new genius at work. Now he tries to break down this very abstract notion in simpler terms, and he claims to do that. He must be aware that the poet must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draughtsman. Yeah? So here he is placing the mind of Europe, the mind of the country, at a level slightly higher than the private mind. The private mind on its own, he is trying to argue that does not have much of a literary existence, does not have much of creative existence. Here is where the political conservatism of Eliot also comes into play. We find that he takes a very radical view, he takes a very radical path when he is exploring his literary modernism, but at the same time he remains very, very conservative in his attitude towards aesthetics, in his attitude towards creative judgment, in his attitude towards literary productions. And this development, refinement, perhaps complication certainly, is not from the point of view of the artist any improvement, perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine, perhaps only in the end based upon a complication in economics and machinery. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past awareness of itself cannot show. So there is something very, very conscious about this entire exercise. There is something very, very deliberate about this entire exercise of artistic and literary production, and that is what makes the historical sense and as well as the individuality of the writer very, very pertinent. And there's a way in which these two can come together without negating each other, but working together to produce a sense of new tradition, which is what he tries to argue throughout this essay as well. Having said this, Eliot now moves on to engage with some of the critiques that this sort of a notion might also give rise to. And in the rest of this essay, at least for some parts of it, in some passages, he tries to engage with some of the critical oppositions that such an aesthetic point of view would also give rise to. So I strongly encourage you to read through this entire essay to get a sense of how the idea of tradition is being taken forward, and we will also come back to look at these criticisms and how Eliot responds to this in the next few passages. So we shall wrap up with this today. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.